Diet and mental health. Psychoanalysis, as practiced in Western medical circles, does not exist in the traditional Chinese medical system. When a patient in the Orient displays symptoms of emotional stress, mental confusion, panic, paranoia, and so forth, quote, the truly good physician first tries to cure it by food, unquote. After carefully analyzing the patient's dietary habits, the Chinese physician usually finds a critical deficiency of vital nutrition or an extreme imbalance in the phar- pharmacodynamic energies contained in the foods consumed. He then proceeds to tonify deficiency and redress imbalance with strict dietary guidelines, supplemented with herbal therapy. It was in Europe where the Taoist students or the standards of diets are deplorably unbalanced that psychotherapy evolved as a formal branch of medicine divorced from physiology. This medical dichotomy is typical of the dualism that lies at the core of Western thought. Despite the dualistic currents in Western thinking, a small handful of dedicated nutritional scientists in America and Europe today have finally rediscovered the quote unquote missing link between body and mind, physical and mental health. And that link turns out to be nutrition. Dr. George Watson of the University of Southern California states the case clearly in his excellent book entitled Nutrition in Your Mind. Quote, we have found functional mental illness to be a direct reflection of disordered metabolism, primarily involving the malfunction of enzyme systems, unquote. The emphasis on enzymes systems is particularly significant in light of the enzyme dead diets of Western societies, which suffer most from mental disturbances. To understand how these links function, we must take a close look at how the brain works. The brain can burn only glucose, which is only known as blood sugar. In fact, the brain, which accounts for only 2.5% of body weight, consumes 25% of all available blood sugar. Unlike other tissues, the brain cannot switch over to fat or other fuels when glucose supplies in the blood run dry. Since blood can only carry enough glucose to last for about 4 hours, any interruption in the steady supply of glucose in the bloodstream results in immediate impairment of the brain. The first or the very first symptoms of mental impairment due to glucose deficiency in the brain is loss of emotional control. The brain gets its glucose from three sources. Some is absorbed directly into the bloodstream and delivered to the brain from such glucose rich foods as grapes and honey. Another source is the breakdown of carbohydrates and their refinement into glucose. A third source is glycogen, which is produced and stored in the liver from the breakdown of proteins and fats. When the relatively limited supplies of glucose from glucose rich foods and carbohydrate digestion are exhausted, the liver converts stored glycogen into glucose and secretes it into the bloodstream to ensure a steady supply of blood sugar to the ever active, hungry brain. In order to break down protein and fat to produce glycogen, the liver must itself burn glucose to fuel this vital metabolic process. A person who follows a fad diet that excludes all carbohydrates and sugars, for example, is unable to furnish sufficient supplies of glucose to process the proteins and the fats he consumes. Consequently, his brain is starved all his brain is starved of all three sources of glucose: natural sugar foods, carbohydrates, and liver glycogen. If, on the other hand, the diet calls for the elimination of protein and fat, then the body has inadequate stores of liver glycogen to take up the slack when glucose in the blood is all consumed. Eliminating fat entirely from the diet is the ultimate folly, for fat is one of the very best sources of food energy. Fat yields 3 times the amount of energy as sugar and twice as much as protein, and it combusts faster and more completely than almost any other food. The key to consuming fat is to avoid incompatible combinations of foods that interfere with its digestion, such as consuming it together with concentrated proteins. When taken in correct combinations from wholesome natural sources, fat will not make you fat. Recall that Eskimos traditionally ate raw blubber and thrived on it. Sufficient supplies of fat are necessary for brain power, and Dr. Watson's extensive research has established a definitive link between too little fat in the diet and chronic mental disturbance. Psychiatrists attach great importance to all sorts of abnormal mental symptoms, such as depression, mania, and neurosis, when in fact these symptoms are usually psychologically meaningless manifestations of severe nutritional imbalance and deficiency. A typical example is the chronic violent behavior associated with critical niacin deficiency. 10 years on the psychiatrist's couch will do nothing to cure this condition, but a sufficient daily dose of niacin will. Let's take a look at a concrete case described by Dr. Watson in his book, Nutrition and Your Mind. A young man was referred to Dr. Watson suffering from severe mental depression and morbid claustrophobia. So afraid was he of small spaces that he had been unable to remain in his own bathroom long enough to take a shower or bath for over 5 years. Upon inquiry, the patient revealed that his daily diet, day in and day out, all year long, consisted entirely of only 3 things: hamburgers, black coffee, and pasteurized skim milk. Due to prolonged malnutrition, Dr. Watson discovered that the patient's cells had almost entirely lost their capacity to convert food into energy. Dr. Watson immediately put him on a balanced diet of protein, fat, and carbohydrate, fresh fruits and vegetables, supplemented with natural vitamins and minerals, and the young man soon recovered his capacity for normal metabolism. His chronic mental depression and his morbid claustrophobia disappeared entirely and permanently. Instead of spending years and wasting a fortune talking to a shrink, the patient was cured in only a few weeks at minimal costs. Fully 80% of Dr. Watson's cases have been prematurely cured of virtually every known form of mental illness using nutritional therapy, including some basket cases referred to him by frustrated psychiatrists. Compare his excellent track record with the results of psychoanalysis. A report by Dr. H.J. Insick in the International Journal of Psychiatry in 1965 evaluated the results of 19 different studies involving over 7,000 psychiatric patients and came to the conclusion that psychotherapy proved of no lasting value whatsoever in helping any of the patients recover from any mental disorder. By contrast, Dr. Watson's nutritional therapy approach to precisely, let me rephrase this. By contrast, Dr. Watson's nutritional approach to precisely the same ailments often effects permanent cures within only a few days or weeks. And while this approach is still regarded as heresy within the orthodox Western medical establishment, it has always been standard procedure in Taoist healing arts. Dr. Watson's work led him to discover for himself the traditional Taoist trinity of essence, energy, and spirit from an entirely modern scientific angle. His realization that, quote, essence, in this case enzymes and other nutrients, must provide the vital energy required to support the spirit or the mind, and it is reflected in the following passage from his book, quote, when one eats, digests, and assimilates, or what one eats, digests, and assimilates, provides the energy producing nutrients that the bloodstream carries to the brain. Any interference with the nutritional supply lines or with the energy producing systems of the brain results in impaired functioning, which then may be called poor mental health. Unquote. Concludes Dr. Watson, quote, "What you eat determines your state of mind and who you are." Truly, quote, food for thought.